button right now.
Yay, thank you.
Right, well, thank you, Professor Tyler. It's a pleasure to have you here. For all those of you who've just joined the call or are perhaps joining the call after the call through our recordings, which are all going out into the Hack From Home account. This is the first full day of Hack From Home, which is our global hackathon to fight the spread and social effects of COVID-19, whilst at the same time striving to preserve the privacy and civil liberties of individuals in their data. It's been a really interesting day here on the expert stage. We've had professors from Korea. We've been talked through data ethics canvases and ways of considering the ethical use of data. We've had considerations on public health and epidemiology. We've had talks on differential privacy and encryption mechanisms, and a whole host besides. We have another great day lined up tomorrow with a whole range of sociologists and anthropologists coming along. And of course, at the same time, our many hundreds of people stretched around the world are all continuing to innovate and iterate. And I can't think of another I, but at any rate, improve. Yes, I thought of it. Improve their projects for the Hack From Home system prior to our presentation sessions tomorrow night. And of course, submission, which let's not forget, is at 23:59 BST for the prizes, which will be next week. Anyway, having exhausted my breath on that particular one, Professor Tyler, we look forward to hearing from you and your presentation on your work.
Great, thanks, James. And I appreciate you and the here Hat Lab for inviting me to give a couple minutes here to talk about what we're doing and see how it might link to people that are interested. I also thank Young Jin Yu from Case Western Reserve here in Cleveland and the X Labs for hooking me up to this hackathon in the first place. So I'm going to actually share a screen and walk through some slides that kind of talk about what I'm doing, and then I would love to hear if there's any comments or questions from anybody that's out there. So hopefully you can see my screen now and not me. I'm just gonna walk through a few things. I'll give you a bit of background of what I do and where we are now and how we think it relates to HAT in particular, data privacy and the like. So I'm working a little bit different than it sounds like the presentations you've heard so far, but I think they're very linked. In fact, it's part of a bigger effort that we're doing here. And this is really around the idea of what I'm calling is human fusions. And what that really stands for is the human, machine, and network in a functional symbiotic integration in the human. And so really at the base level, we're reimagining the human connection. And so to give you a bit of background, what I've done, my history here is I've worked in prosthetics to start with. And ultimately, when people lose their hand, they lose not just the function of the hand, but they also lose the sense of touch. And they lose that connection to the world, which is actually very interesting. Most of the people, when we talk about start doing our work, when they come into the lab, we thought they would be interested in the idea of restoring mechanical or functional aspects of their hand. But really what they're interested in is the ability to connect with other people, to hold a loved one hand or to touch people. And so we've been working on that, and I won't give you all the details of that work. But a couple of key phrases that have come up in our research that's really led us to this leap that is what we're doing today or what we're doing now and talking about today. And so one of the things, just the idea of how important the sense of touch and activity is that, you know, one of our subjects after he took the arm home said, you know, I only use my remaining arm when he was picking up his granddaughter. So before he had the sense of touch, he'd only use his intact arm because he was worried about hurting her. As soon as we had the sense of touch, he sent this picture back to us and said he was just happy to pick her up right straight away because he could feel her and not have to worry too hard about squeezing her. It changed his interaction with her in a very positive and definitive way. And one of the comments that we're leaping from, and this is a picture from several years ago, the early system, but I just like the picture. It says basically our subject, when we weren't having the sense of touch, he said, my prosthetic with no sensation is a tool at the end of my arm. But when I turn that sensation on, it becomes my hand. Essentially, that changes the difference from a tool and just a device he's using to his hand. And that language shift is really important. But really where we're jumping off for today, so this isn't a talk necessarily about prosthetics or the interesting idea that I want to present, but rather what we're talking about is this is prosthetic. We can think of that not as a prosthesis that goes on his arm, but a robotic system that we can put anywhere in the world and it would still feel like his hand. Because we take the data that comes from sensors that are embedded in this system and transfer that digitally, right? So these wires going off could go off to the device that we have sitting behind his chair, or it could go over the internet to a device behind his chair. And so effectively, this idea of my hand now is no longer limited to his body. And I think when we start to expand on what that is, this concept of connecting around the world and expanding where you are, we start thinking about these questions of virtual reality, or mixed reality, or augmented reality. But we start to even ask the question, really, what is reality? And so this was kind of explored in the virtual world from the Ready Player One book and Ernest Cline, and I'll get to that in just a second. But we also start to think about these questions that are going on today, as many of you are probably more aware even than I, around artificial intelligence, or even in biology, we have this engineering the genome type of work that's going on, or even this questions of cyborg versus a human, and we start to wonder, where is that boundary? And I think that question of human versus technology is the wrong question. And really coming back to this, what is reality and where are we at? We can go back to philosophically the base of Immanuel Kant, that we know that all of our knowledge, everything that we are, begins with our senses. So our only entire interaction with the world comes from our senses. So the fact that we can actually now digitize our sense of experience of the world is in many ways digitizing the human experience and now putting it in something that we can put onto the world and over the web. And what we can think about now, and what we are thinking about, is this idea of, if I have an interface to the human on these, and so we think the advantages over haptic gloves and are out there now, is we're actually directly connecting to the nervous system in various ways. And so now we think of this idea of, touch in a prosthetic or a robotic system somewhere in the world, transferred over the internet, and then provided directly back to the user as though they feel their hand. And we can do this, and we're working towards systems that are basically not just wearable like a backpack, but just truly wearable. It can be embedded in clothing, or can be embedded in rings or something of that nature. And so the idea of putting, say, for example, a avatar face onto the robotic avatar. So we work with phenomenologists, for example, to ask the question of, what is it so the person on this end of the connection working with the robot actually feels like they're working with a human? As many of you probably know, if you have robotic systems that try to mimic the human too closely, this actually ends up to be very freaky. But if we have a picture or a video of somebody, we can connect. And the other thing I'll point out is that we're controlling this system, just like we are with the prosthetic. We can actually control this hand by the user thinking about what they want to do. That's picked up through the muscle activity, then transferred back, so the robot works exactly or very much like the person's hand. And so not only are we transferring the idea of this sensation, the connection through the network, we're also conveying the agency, the control of that robot. And effectively, if we were to put camera systems in here, put it mounted to the head, so as the person turns the head, the robot turns the head, you see visually as though your head were here, you can effectively become located here. And so it moves you ultimately throughout where you are in space. Sorry, I was pointing to the wrong screen, so I'll put this back over here. We're talking about this idea of the sensors on the avatar connecting directly to you. So when you see from a camera system here, if you see that simultaneously when the robotic hand touches something and you feel it in your hand, effectively you begin to embody that situation. In which case, again, we're transferring the experience of being a human, sort of our teletransportation system, where your experience, maybe not you physically, but everything that matters is transported to that system over the network. And so this is the idea we're calling neural reality, because we're using this through a connection to the nervous system, which directly connects back to what the sensor's used to in the real place, which allows us a lot of advantages I'd be happy to talk about. But essentially it enables this human mind to transcend the barriers of the physical body to create more meaningful connections and really unbound our potential. And so that's the area we're doing. We can think of the human moving out in various different directions, so that you can basically be anywhere and any time in the way we're doing this. And we start to envision this in the areas of healthcare, delivery, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a couple minutes, disaster relief. So imagine healthcare. COVID-19 right now is what a lot of us are very interested in doing, but imagine if the healthcare worker, which we have all these N95 problems, limitations, and the risk that we're putting our healthcare workers into, if we could separate them physically, but make them, put them there in all other ways that they can work with the patients without actually physically putting themselves at risk. This is a significant change. But it's not just COVID-19. That's now, COVID-19 is here today, but epidemics are here always. And so we have SARS, Ebola, and then even just in the general areas of telemedicine. Same concept, you can imagine disaster relief. And so, for example, if you have a Fukushima event where, again, it's highly toxic and dangerous to the physical individual, but if you could actually somehow rescue people that may be there, or a fire, earthquake, 9/11, any of these type of things, or medevac in the military. Again, if we can separate the physical from the real world, and we can put an avatar system out there by transferring that experience and control over the net, we can do that. And then even just simply things like social connection, where we can, now we're doing physical distancing, but I actually prefer the idea of we're doing, you know, not social distancing. And if we can change that, so, you know, keep it more of the physical distancing, but not the social distancing, we can change what's going on. And you can only imagine within in the areas of empathy and experience what somebody else is, or media, gaming, entertainment. So there's a lot of opportunities for where we are. Just one last thing I'll say, you know, we're kind of at the point, people ask me all the time, how close are we to this? In many ways, I say this is a great analogy. You know, back in the late 60s, this was the cell phone. It took out the back of your car. It cost more than the car, and 2 people had it because of one tower that existed in the world. But I love this thing of a person getting home at 186,000 miles per second, this idea of your existence traveling. Now, of course, you know where we are not that long later. Everybody in the world has a cell phone in their pocket. And it's probably more ubiquitous than any other means, which is leading to a lot of these hackathons and why the work you're doing today is so critical. So I think we're maybe here, maybe even ahead of this a little bit in terms of overall, but I could see the day where essentially we're all connected through these direct systems. So in the bigger Human Fusion Institute that we're working here, that we'd love to have people partner with, ultimately we think is a transdisciplinary approach. You know, our first thing, we talk about the technical of how do we do it, but we have to think bigger than that. And this relates very closely with Hat in the work that you're doing today, is not just how do we, but should we? What are the ethical boundaries? What should be, again, we're talking about the human experience. Where is the boundary? What should be transferred? Who do we transfer it to? Who controls it? How do we control it? And then how do we manage all that? How do we create the systems to do it? How do we transfer that, the entrepreneurial side of how do we actually make this a reasonable system that can be moved out into the broader public? And then what are the impacts on the societal side of things? And of course, all around, this is going to be an iterative process. So a couple projects today. This is very short. I want to leave time for some questions and not overwhelm with what's going on. But we have right now, we're working towards this idea, particularly in the time of COVID, is trying to develop this idea of the healthcare avatar. And so there's a link if you're interested in some of the things that we're doing there, or some background on that you could take a look at. And there's actually a link in this website to contact us, if you're interested in being a part of that, providing your information to the future. And ultimately, we are part of ANA. Japanese airline has actually started several years ago, began this idea of an avatar XPrize. And it's really, I think what I'd like to point out about this is I'm impressed that ANA, which is a transport company, is really out there being more proactive in thinking about traveling doesn't have to be physical, but it's the experience of where you are. And so they've sponsored this Avatar XPrize, which is right around the work that we're doing. And so this is a project that we're in, and we could use partnership on doing it. This is obviously a very collaborative effort. We have pretty much all the university and different phases of it here at Case Western involved, several external partners that we've been engaged with in developing these technologies and want to continue forward, and be happy to, actually I'd say a lot of what we have has been very hardware centric for the beginning, but now that we have a lot of those pieces of hardware, we could really add significant efforts on the software side of things as well. This gives just a brief sort of, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. You guys are more expert than I am on this, but just the concept of where we're headed is essentially on one side of the system, you have the human, we have these interfaces to them for the experiential components. These shared are sort of these secure human attached routers. So basically this is the hardware that takes human experience or human data from this side, EMG, converts it into a language that can be understood by a machine, and then takes machine data and converts it back to the human experience. So we can see that our idea is that we have these essentially shared server systems that sit on the edges of the network, and we can build ultimately over this network a universal language that's agnostic to the end device. It's the human, it can be the human in many different ways, whether it's a haptic glove, like many of you probably know, with bladders and mechanical impacts, or the system we're working with in terms of neural interfacing. It should be agnostic to the data being sent from the device. And so if we take a physical sensor, for example, and transfer it over, if we have a universal idea of what the human relation, that universal layer is, then whatever's on this side, the physical system that's interacting with the human, be it a vibrating haptic glove or our system, that would then be able to translate appropriately to that interconnect. And so the interesting part is really here, I think, related to this hackathon and what HAT does and what we're working on, is how do we transfer this securely? You know, at this point, we have not, I wrote these two little boxes like they're simple. It's because it's not where my expertise is. Ultimately, once we get this data out there, how do we send it where it wants to go? How do you not hack it? How do you control it if you're the user that wants to connect? How can I say I want to type in the web address of any different device out in the world and become part of that device? How do we secure that and control it? And so all these pieces about the interface, I think, is a very interesting opportunity. And kind of the places that we're looking at, you know, we just talked about the secure network connections. The critical part about this too, especially if we start to think of building encryption and all these other pieces in there, this is human experience. And what we know from the work we do is that latency is critical. You know, if I do something and it takes more than 100 milliseconds for it to have an impact on the system I'm connecting with and that data to come back to me, it becomes no longer part of who I am. It becomes harder to control. And then we have the bandwidth of the visual, the tactile, and the synchrony, and all these other data channels we will put on there. And then synchrony is really important. If my visual feedback comes back and it's not connected with my tactile, it also ruins the entirety of this transference of experience. I think all of us have watched, particularly nowadays with bandwidths being limited, a net streaming or some streaming video, and you see the lips move and the voice comes a little behind it. It doesn't take much of a lag or desynchronization before it becomes really almost unbearable. And there's a lot of opportunity for UIX, the platform developers themselves, you know, application developers on the different ends. So basically all levels of the software would be something that if anybody's interested, we'd love to have partners to help continue and develop in these areas. So with that, that was the end of sort of the really whirlwind overview of the work we're doing. And I wanted to present seed questions if anybody is interested. And there's a bunch of contact information here that if you are interested, I'll leave this up for a little bit while we start on questions that I'd be happy to follow up with later. So I appreciate your time for listening to that. And I hope there's some people that would have some questions, or I guess I'll turn it back to you, James, in moderating this.
Well, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. I don't know why my video isn't working, but you know, you'd see me looking very very intrigued by that. I mean, there's so much to talk about with that particular application. There's you know the system as a system itself, even that box on, what is it, the universal layer you're calling it?
So I can talk a little more about this. Yeah. So essentially, what we've been developing this infrastructure. We have some work here now, and we're getting close to, and what we're looking to do is have an API, if you will, that we can put out there. The question becomes, you know, if you have, in our case, early work has been in prosthetic hands, for example, and, you know, we began saying, all right, it's EMG activity controlling the motors of a prosthetic. But broadly speaking, it doesn't have to be a prosthetic. It could be any sort of system that's out there where, you know, it could be like we were showing in earlier examples, a robotic avatar that's holding, you know, it's basically trying to do something with stethoscope. The question is, if you don't know what that is, you know, what is the universal language that can be interpreted on both sides? So I can put EMG out in a command layer that's sort of a universal that somebody can pick up and say, okay, here's how this data is coming into me. And so we've been developing really this a bit broader, you know, break this down into taking any human data, putting it into a common language, right? So we're developing kind of the backgrounds to develop a common data language that would be shared amongst everyone, as well as the libraries to put those together and transfer them over the net. And that way, as long as I know what the common language is on the human side, I can write and basically operate in that level here. And if this knows what the common language is and the same, then they can operate on that same data, given that it knows exactly the characteristics it's supposed to have.
Remarkable. It sort of makes me think, you know, that there's so many things to it. I mean, I remember, so in the Oxford Internet Institute writes quite a lot about matters connected to this. I mean, on one hand, there's what does it mean to be a person, you know, as a initially a soul, but then perhaps just as an embodied self, when you are actually just no longer necessarily embodied. That then obviously then gets into the whole interesting thing of, well, you know, what if then the body bit disappears and there's some sort of disembodied sensing thing? What then is that? You then have that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I was reading something about how, well, if we're positing a world where there's already going to be smart devices everywhere, such that computation is just everywhere all the time, even leaving aside computation, but just sort of sensing, what does that then mean for how a human can come to experience reality, because it can be not just a question of you being in a robotic avatar, but what if you're also a wall?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. This is just sort of a quick, these are conversations we have all the time around this. Is it doesn't have to be a sense of touch either. It could be ultrasound data that you're using through your hand. Basically it's no longer what your skin or the physical senses of your skin are doing. It's whatever you can convert from a data perspective. It can be completely virtual. So I think, there's
types of experience that previously have just never been had, in a sense, by a human, because you're taking an ultrasound or any kind of signal that we can't actually perceive with our ordinary sensing capabilities.
Exactly. Well, the world is like that now, right? This seems kind of like a really unique idea, but the reality is we take ultrasound data and we put it into a picture all the time. The thing is, we only have two forms of interface to the human right now, visual and audio, basically. And what this does is allows us to open up the third of the 5 channels. And, the concept overall is that because we can connect to the nervous system, because we directly do that. So audio and visual is nice because your eyes and your ears are concentrated. We can build headphones. People have been developing these really sophisticated tools, and really virtual reality is the pinnacle of that right now. But touch is a much different thing, and the other senses like the vestibular and the other pieces of the body are much more difficult to get at from that perspective. But if we have a direct connection to the nervous system, at least in our approach here, now the ideas apply broadly, but from us, it doesn't matter anymore where the source of the data came from. I don't need that sensor. I can directly put the neural language in there. Now, I just want to make a comment to the earlier thing you said. We talk a lot about smart devices, and what I find interesting now is a lot of people are talking about the human being unnecessary, et cetera. And I think that's never going to happen, right? I still think that, I don't think that, and this is a much broader but more interesting conversation than the couple minutes we have left. But the idea of what the brain is and what our memories are, I think too often the computer processing people, the algorithm people, and I'm a double E by training before I was a biomedical engineer, we think about the brain as a digital system, and it's not even close. And so the analogies of storing the human memory in the computer usually are flawed in many ways. So I don't think that's an interesting question as much as it is. And what interests me far more is this idea of symbiotic relationship. I actually am really excited about the things that AI can do and data management, right? As a human, I don't have access to the same breadth of data that a computer system does. I'm not trying to compete with that. And the same thing as a computer doesn't have the way I process data. I don't know that it should try to compete with that. Let's put them together so we can use the human's ability to think outside the box as a generic term, right? But basically this idea to extrapolate, well, computers are great at interpolating. And then we can put those together, and that will make us so much better. So I think those are the things that we should be thinking about, the question, not of how can AI and all these things replace us, but how do we work more effectively between the two of them and communicate that information in a more effective manner? Thinking of, again, back to the conversation we just had a second ago about ultrasound, for example. You can also think of this not so much as giving the sense of touch, but the other way of thinking about it is a new data channel. So as we talked about, now I don't have to crowd everything in my visual and audio space. I could actually provide things through the touch. You can imagine, for example, that if I'm a pilot, I could feel, let's kind of think about sticking your hand out the side, the window of your car and feel the airflow. What if the same thing was when you were flying the plane and you can tell the sense of the stall on the wings by the pressure on your fingers, as opposed to some alarm ringing throughout the cabin? So we could really reimagine the whole way that we interact with. And from an AI perspective, the amount of data coming in is limited by how well I can take it in. But if I can now find new ways to interface to the human to provide that data back and forth, I think we could really change the way that we interface with the, with the world around us.
Yeah.
I see a question came in. I don't know if, on
yes, absolutely.
Psychological impact of these systems. I think we have, not to the perspective as to what's being asked here, talking about how long can we connect to the system, et cetera. We have more data right now, again, in the prosthetics world. And, people basically, when we send them home with the device with and without sensation, when they have this feeling of embodiment of the machine, they wear it more. They tend to interact with others around them more. They tend to connect to the world much more readily. I don't know that I'm looking at this system right now as maybe put it here. I've seen some people that looked at this in terms of embedding themselves forever in the virtual world, right? This Ready Player One approach. I actually am not, I don't have the knowledge of what that is. I think there's a lot of psychological questions as indicated here to answer that. But again, I'm not trying to, I mean, my ideas right now, or what we're trying to do, is not necessarily replace reality, but allow us to move reality as needed, et cetera. So I think these are great questions that still, again, we're early in that phase. And part of the team we're building is looking at the psychosocial folks, the sociology people that can answer these questions and actually start to look at this as we become more directly connected to the technology.
Interesting. And I think, you know, one of the things when we chatted just for this call is, you know, there's just so many considerations to it. The technical, the social, the legal. One of the things that particularly interested me was what we're referring to about how this system could interface with multiple users of one device, and how that was going to be translated backwards and forwards, and what that might mean if you're getting, you know, depending upon the particular applied version of the system, if you're having, you know, data from underneath someone's skin, and you're building this more whole profile of who they are and how they react to, I guess, anything has competed with. We really must talk, you know, after this hackathon about the Think box concept that we've been working on here in the Hat Lab, which is a conceptual space that enables personal data, enables for the personal data generated through interaction with a shared device to be held in one space, and then for the personal data of individuals from that shared device to then be flown into a space that they can own and control, separate to anyone else, utilizing, of course, the hub of all things, personal data accounts. I think there's potentially some very interesting use cases there for what is, by any stretch, going to be some incredibly sensitive personal data
For sure.
generated through your system.
Well,
But,
not only, I think
yes.
there's two sides of that. I agree. I look forward to continuing these dialogues. But because it's way more than the time we have here, but I think there's two ways even looking at what you're saying. One is the live stream. You know, what do you experience simultaneous? Maybe three of us are controlling a large machine. I mean, there's a lot of different things to think about simultaneous connection. Who can experience what I'm experiencing, right? If I have sensors on my hand and I'm doing something, you'll be able to feel it. How do I deal with that? And there's other, you know, broader aspect to that, but there's also then the interesting part of, you know, right, we store memories now in videos and pictures. What if we added these other dimensions to them? You know, how much more realistic does that experience become, and who should have access to that? Who should be able to relive my memories at that level of intimacy? And how do I control it? Maybe I want them to see the video, but not my sense of touch. You know, so again, there's a lot of different ways that this question becomes highly relevant and interesting.
And that, of course, would have such profound implications for the memory itself, because memory, obviously, it isn't static. It evolves. You tend to forget the pain you suffered. You'll know, I can't remember when or where it was, but was it not colonoscopies? People just sort of delete the painful middle bits in their mind and focus on the sensations they had at the beginning and the end. Yet if you're there actually offering people what they always felt, then maybe their perceptions of their past won't be quite so malleable. Fascinating.
Yep.
Really, really fascinating. Well, unless there's any more questions from the floor, this is the time is up for this particular session. Been a really, really interesting talk. If anyone, Dustin, if you're free to join and ask me anything panel, in case anyone has any further questions, you're most welcome. We have some of those open in Slack.
Okay.
I can send you a link if you're interested in that.
That would be fine. I will have that up. I'll be at the computer for a little bit, and say people have had, if they're interested or in the recording, the link information is there, and I'd be happy to follow up with anybody after that we're interested.
Fantastic. And in terms of other news for anyone who's here in this meeting, we're actually going to be having the happy hour, which is taking place. The details have been posted on Slack, so you'll be able to find those if you go into the general channel. That will actually be a meeting format rather than a webinar format, so we can all look at one another and judge one another's sitting rooms as we all sit locked down in isolation. All right. Well, thanks very much, guys, for the call. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all very much.